Believe it or not, once upon a time, the Detroit Lions were a force to be reckoned with. Back in the 1950s, the Lions captured 3 NFL championships in a 6-year span, cementing themselves as powerhouses in the league's early days and positioning themselves to be one of the most decorated and storied franchises in football history. And then, with one regrettable move, the Lions' fortunes took a swift and profound turn for the worse. As legend has it, in fact, thanks to their own questionable decision-making, the Lions supposedly fell under a curse that consigned them to a generation of mediocrity, a curse that's seemingly still in effect 65 years later. While the first few decades of NFL history were largely dominated by the Green Bay Packers and Chicago Bears, by the 1950s, the Detroit Lions were on the come-up. And their ascension was largely fueled by one superstar talent, Bobby Layne. A standout quarterback at the University of Texas, Layne was a 4-time All-Conference honoree who set countless school records with the Longhorns. Records that stood for decades, including all-time passing yards, passing touchdowns, and victories by a quarterback. His excellence made him the number 3 overall pick in the 1948 NFL Draft, and only a year later, he was establishing himself as one of the most promising young quarterbacks in the league. In 1949, after getting traded from Chicago to the soon-to-be-defunct New York Bulldogs, Layne finished 5th in the NFL in passing yards and completion percentage, flashing big-time potential in his sophomore season. And it was that potential that compelled the Lions to trade for him ahead of the 1950 campaign, acquiring him from New York in exchange for wide receiver Bob Mann. A deal that would eventually go down as perhaps the greatest in Lions history. Mann didn't end up playing a single game for New York, while Layne went on to become the most decorated quarterback the Lions ever had. In his first season with Detroit, Layne took another major step forward, leading the NFL in passing yards while finishing 3rd among QBs with 4 rushing touchdowns. The following year, Layne earned his first of 6 career Pro Bowl nods, leading the league in passing yards and passing touchdowns. He was cementing himself as one of the game's best quarterbacks, a master of the 2-minute drill, and his growth was about to transform Detroit into a juggernaut. In 1952, Layne propelled the Lions to their best record since their 10-3 inaugural campaign almost 2 decades prior, and their first championship berth since their lone NFL title in 1935. Along the way, Layne helped the Lions set a then-franchise record for points and earned his first All-Pro nomination in the process. And when the Lions squared off against the mighty Cleveland Browns for the NFL championship, Layne played a starring role, running in the game's first touchdown in the second quarter and ultimately shepherding Detroit to the second league title in franchise history. And then he did it again. In 1953, Layne led the defending champion Lions to their best ever record and a second straight NFL championship, another victory over Cleveland. And it was Layne who played the hero with the title on the line, engineering an 80-yard drive with his team trailing in the fourth quarter that ended with a go-ahead 33-yard touchdown pass. With a pair of championships under his belt and a trove of individual accolades, Layne had cemented himself as a franchise icon at 27 and was putting together a Hall of Fame resume. He then beefed up that resume in 1956 with his second career All-Pro nomination, and in 1957, after missing the playoffs 2 years in a row, Layne played a key role for a resurgent Lions team that roared back to relevance. Despite chasing away longtime head coach Buddy Parker just weeks before the season with their relentless debauchery, the Gashouse Gang Lions took care of business on the field, positioning themselves as title favorites with their new-look offense. See, it wasn't just Layne who played quarterback for the Lions in '57. The 31-year-old actually split time with newcomer Tobin Rote, the league's leading passer in '56 who was acquired by Detroit in an offseason trade. Together, the two propelled the Lions to an 8-4 record. And when Layne suffered a broken ankle in the penultimate week of the regular season, Detroit had a more than adequate fill-in ready to go. In Layne's absence, Rote led the Lions to an epic comeback victory over San Francisco in the Western Division Final, then threw for 4 touchdowns in a blowout of Cleveland for the NFL championship, Detroit's 3rd in a 6-year span. Little did everyone know, however, that that championship would set in motion a generation of misery in Detroit, a decades-long stretch of futility that still has yet to end. In the wake of Rote's incredible performance in the '57 championship game, and his strong body of work overall, the Lions clearly had 2 capable starting quarterbacks heading into the '58 campaign. And although Lane and Rote had split snaps to great success the year prior, the Lions brass felt the situation was untenable, that friction was bound to build as they jockeyed for playing time. Initially, the Lions tried to soldier on with their quarterback timeshare, but that approach was short-lived. And after both quarterbacks attempted double-digit passes in a season-opening loss to the Baltimore Colts, it was Rote, not Lane, who got the bulk of the snaps in Week 2. A development that hinted at the shocking, franchise-altering move that was looming. Not even 24 hours after Detroit's Week 2 tie against the Packers, the Lions traded away their longtime linchpin and one of the league's most decorated quarterbacks, shipping Lane to Pittsburgh for quarterback Earl Morrall and a pair of draft picks. And to put it mildly, it was a head-scratcher of a trade, a deal that mystified every football fan in Detroit. Lane was the Lions' guy, a three-time champion only a year removed from an All-Pro nomination, with lots of winning football seemingly left in him. It beggared belief that Detroit would send away a still productive franchise icon and give his job to someone else. The official explanation for the seemingly inexplicable deal was that having two viable starting quarterbacks didn't work, and that trading Lane away gave the Lions an opportunity to get their future QB1 in Morrall and two highly valuable draft picks. However, many suspected that there may have been other motivating factors at play. For one, Lane's well-established drinking habit had long made the organization uncomfortable, and his arrest for drunk driving in 1957 cast something of a pall over the team's championship season. Meanwhile, Lane was also suspected of gambling on football and possibly even his own games. According to former Packers star Paul Hornung, Lane gambled more than anybody who ever played football, period. And as investigative journalist and best-selling author Dan Moldea reported in an explosive 2014 expose, according to several bookmakers and law enforcement officials, Lane was thought to have shaved points or participated in the fixing of several NFL games. Whether that was true or not, though, Lane's long and largely illustrious tenure in Detroit was over, and he was none too pleased about it. As he emptied out his locker, Lane boiled with anger and allegedly muttered some bitter parting words that would eventually become a dreadful part of Lions lore. I say allegedly because none of the sports writers in the Lions locker room reported his comments in the next day's newspaper, but as the story goes, Lane cursed the Lions on his way out the door, saying they won't win again for another 50 years. At the time, of course, it seemed like nothing more than spiteful words from a scorned superstar. But then the losing started. In '58, with Rote as their quarterback, the Lions stumbled to a 4-7-1 record and a 5th place finish in their division. And to add insult to injury, Lane went on to earn a Pro Bowl nod in his first season with the Steelers, leading them to their first winning season in roughly a decade. But that was just the beginning. In '59, with Morrall now under center, the Lions were even worse, going 3-8-1. And so began one of the most miserable stretches ever endured by a pro sports team, a decades-long run of failure that turned the curse of Bobby Lane from a superstition into an unshakable burden. Following their fateful trade in '58, the Lions made the playoffs once over the next 24 seasons. In their lone trip to the postseason during that time, the Lions didn't score a single point, getting shut out by the Dallas Cowboys in 1970. And although Detroit enjoyed a moment of respectability in the early 1980s, a serious Super Bowl threat they were not. In 1982, in their first playoff game in more than a decade, the Lions lost by 24 points. And the following year's divisional round defeat was even more heartbreaking, with Joe Montana throwing a go-ahead touchdown pass with less than 90 seconds remaining in the fourth quarter. The remainder of the decade was a painful slog, and while the eventual arrival of Barry Sanders imbued the Wobegon franchise with hope, his greatness was ultimately no match for the curse. Although the Sanders-led 1991 Lions did manage to win a playoff contest, vanquishing the Cowboys in the divisional round for their first postseason victory since the '57 championship game, that win also represents the franchise's most glorious moment since the '57 championship game. Throughout the 1990s, the Lions lost in the first round of the playoffs a whopping 5 times, and the franchise subsequently devolved into a full-on laughingstock. Since the turn of the 21st century, the Lions have put up the second lowest winning percentage in the NFL, they've stumbled through 14 seasons with double-digit losses, and in 2008, they earned the dubious distinction of being the first team in NFL history to go 0-16. As it happens, 2008 was precisely 50 years after Lane was traded, and that winless season seemed like a fitting way for the curse to end. But a decade and a half later, the Lions still have yet to reverse their fortunes. It's as if they're still held back by supernatural forces. Since their humiliating 2008 campaign, the Lions have made the playoffs only a scant few times and were bounced in the first round on each occasion. Through the 2022 campaign, in fact, the Lions were the only NFL team without a playoff win this century. And while the most recent iterations of the team have looked as capable as any other since '58 of breaking the curse, the Lions have embodied futility for so long that it's impossible not to be cynical about their chances. And until they get back to football's mountaintop and snap a title drought that stretches all the way back to the Eisenhower administration, the franchise and its fan base will continue to be tortured by the curse of Bobby Lane. Thanks for watching. If you like this video and want to see more content like this, hit that subscribe button.